On the night of February 24th, 1978, 5 men attended a college basketball game in Chico, California. They were not thrill seekers. They were not looking for adventure. They were not planning to disappear. They were friends, coworkers, teammates, men who lived by routine, structure, and familiarity. They watched the game. They celebrated the win. They bought snacks at a local store. Witnesses later said everything seemed normal. Just after 10 p.m., the men got into a single car and began the drive home. The road south led back to safety, to warm houses, to families waiting. But instead, the car turned east. Mile by mile, the city lights faded behind them. The road climbed higher. The temperature dropped. Somewhere along that drive, a decision was made, or perhaps no decision at all. By the next morning, 5 men were missing. Days later, searchers discovered their car parked on a remote mountain road deep inside the Plumas National Forest. Snow surrounded the vehicle. The air was thin and cold. The car was not crashed. It was not stuck. It still had fuel. The doors were closed, the windows were intact, the engine could have been started, but the keys were gone. Investigators stood in silence, trying to understand why 5 men would abandon a perfectly functional vehicle and walk into freezing wilderness at night. There were no footprints leading back toward the road, only tracks heading uphill, away from safety. As days turned into weeks, hope began to fade. Then months later, a discovery changed everything. Deep in the mountains, inside a government trailer stocked with food, heat, and supplies, one of the men was found dead. He had not frozen. He had starved. Cans of food sat untouched. Matches were nearby. The heater had been turned on. He had survived for weeks, maybe longer, slowly wasting away while help existed just miles away. Other bodies were found scattered across the wilderness, some miles apart, some in places that made no sense. One man was never found at all. There were no signs of violence, no evidence of a crime, no clear explanation. Investigators were left with only questions. Why did the men drive into the mountains? Why did they leave the car? Why did they ignore shelter and food? Why did they walk uphill into snow and darkness? The case became known as the Yuba County Five, often compared to the Dyatlov Pass incident, not because of what happened to them, but because no one could explain why. This is not a story about getting lost. It is a story about choices that defy logic, about silence in the mountains, and about 5 men who walked into the cold and left behind a mystery that has never been solved. On the night of February 24, 1978, 5 men left a small college basketball game in Chico, California. It was cold, but the roads were clear. Nothing about that evening suggested danger. The men were friends, not strangers, not reckless thrill seekers. Gary Mathias was 25. He was intelligent, outspoken, and struggled with schizophrenia, though it was considered controlled with medication. Jack Madruga was 30, quiet, responsible, and the owner of the car. Bill Sterling was 29, gentle and deeply routine-oriented. Ted Wire was 32, soft-spoken, living with mild intellectual disability. Jack Hewitt was 24, friendly and eager to please. They all lived structured lives. They worked, they followed schedules, they were known for reliability. That night, they watched a basketball game at California State University, Chico. They cheered, they joked, they bought snacks. Witnesses later said nothing seemed unusual. After the game, instead of heading south toward home in Yuba City, Jack Madruga drove east, away from familiar roads, toward the mountains. No one could explain why. Sometime after midnight, the men vanished. Their families waited. At first, they assumed the group had simply stayed overnight somewhere, but by morning, concern began to grow. They never missed work. They never missed appointments. They never failed to check in. On February 28th, 4 days later, a forest ranger found Jack Madruga's car high in the Plumas National Forest. The location was shocking. The car was parked neatly along a remote mountain road, over 70 miles from their intended route. The road was icy, but the vehicle was not stuck. It had fuel. It had no mechanical damage. The keys were missing. Inside the car were maps, candy wrappers, and personal belongings. The men were gone. Temperatures in the area had dropped below freezing. Snow covered the ground. Survival without shelter would have been nearly impossible for long. Search teams flooded the area. Helicopters flew overhead. Volunteers combed the forest. Weeks passed. Then, in June, 4 months later, a group of motorcyclists discovered a trailer used by the U.S. Forest Service, deep in the wilderness. Inside, they found Ted Wyer's body. He was lying on a bed, wrapped in sheets, missing his shoes. Ted had starved to death. This discovery raised immediate questions. The trailer was stocked with food, enough to feed one person for over a year. Canned goods, heating fuel, matches. Someone had turned on the heat. Someone had opened the cans, but not enough to survive. Ted had lost over 100 pounds. Investigators found his beard had grown long. He had been alive for weeks, possibly months after the disappearance. Why didn't he eat the food? Why didn't he leave the trailer? Why didn't he light a fire properly? Nearby, searchers found the remains of Jack Hewitt and Bill Sterling. Jack's body was never fully recovered, only bones scattered across the area. Bill's remains were found beneath snow, partially buried. Gary Mathias was never found. Jack Madruga was found much later, far from the others. The distances between the bodies made no sense. Some of the men traveled uphill, exhausting, dangerous terrain, instead of following the road downhill towards safety. None of them were dressed for winter conditions. Ted Wyer's shoes were missing, likely taken by someone else who needed them more. Investigators believe the men stayed together at first, but at some point the group fractured. Why? One theory suggested Gary Mathias had a psychotic episode and led the group astray, but those who knew Gary said he was the most capable of surviving, the most logical, and he was missing. Another theory suggested confusion, fear, and group panic, but that still failed to explain the food, the shelter, and the choices made afterward. Ted Wyer had the intelligence to understand food labels. He had the strength to open cans, partially. He had heat, yet he died slowly. The Forest Service trailer was less than 20 miles from a mountain lodge, stocked, staffed, and warm. No one ever walked there. The case became known as the American Dyatlov Pass, not because of violence, not because of clear disaster, but because of irrational decisions that no one could explain. Families were left with fragments of truth. Gary Mathias's parents never received his body. They died without knowing whether he survived longer than the others, or if he left the mountains entirely. The official conclusion listed exposure and starvation, but it explained nothing about why the men went there in the first place. No drugs were found, no crime was proven, and no definitive timeline was established. 5 men went to watch a basketball game. 4 were found dead, 1 vanished forever, and the mountains of Northern California kept the reason. To this day, no explanation fully fits the evidence. The Yuba County 5 did not act like lost men. They acted like men following something or someone they trusted, and that is what makes the case so disturbing.